Tonight on Tower Talks, the United States' first humanitarian aid drop into Gaza happened over the weekend. More on what was provided to the citizens in Gaza and the United States' future plans for providing more aid. Earlier today, the Supreme Court weighed in on a Texas immigration law. More on the back and forth in the courts regarding Senate Bill 4. Earlier, the results of the campus-wide elections were announced. A look at the highlights, including the next student body president and vice president. And primaries across the nation continued last week, and the Supreme Court weighed in on whether former President Trump is eligible to run. More on what's happening in the nationwide primaries. And finally, right here in the Lone Star State, the Texas primaries will sit down with our panel of student leaders to talk about tomorrow's election and efforts on campus to turn out the student vote. Later this evening, we will also hear from Joshua Blank, the research director of the Texas Politics Project. All of this coming up right here on Tower Talks. Good evening and welcome to Tower Talks, the show where we take a closer look at stories affecting Texans, Austinites, and students right here at UT Austin. I'm Logan Dubel, and later this evening we will speak to student leaders about the primary election. But before we get to that, there is a lot going on internationally across the state of Texas and right here on campus, so let's get into it. Last week, President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. would be providing aid to civilians in the Gaza Strip. According to NBC News, the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, Samantha Power, said that the U.S. would be providing Gaza with $53 million worth of humanitarian assistance. NBC also reports that last week, President Biden said, quote, "In the coming days, we're going to join with our friends in Jordan and others in providing airdrops of additional food and supplies," end quote. According to BBC, the first U.S. airdrop happened over the weekend and was carried out with Jordan's Air Force. 30,000 meals parachuted down into Gaza by 3 military planes. This aid airdrop into Gaza is the first of many for the U.S., but because aid agencies have said that airdrops are an inefficient and expensive way to provide aid, President Biden said the U.S. is insisting that Israel should facilitate more routes for aid trucks to get through, according to BBC. They've also reported that U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris will be meeting with Benny Gantz, that's an Israeli war cabinet member, to discuss a truce and other issues. Back here at home, the 5th U.S. Court of Appeals reversed a lower court's ruling late Saturday that halted Senate Bill 4 from going into effect, according to the Texas Tribune. Senate Bill 4 is a law that could allow Texas police to arrest those suspected of crossing the Texas-Mexico border illegally. The law also requires state judges to order migrants returned to Mexico if they are convicted under that law. The law was scheduled to take effect tomorrow, Tuesday, March 5th, but it was blocked by federal judge David Ezra, who believed that the law could inspire other states to create their own immigration laws and make for inconsistencies across the country. He claims, quote, SB 4 threatens the fundamental notion that the United States must regulate immigration with one voice, end quote. The New Orleans-based appeal court instituted a 7-day pause on their new reversal to allow for an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and earlier today, the higher court intervened, halting the law and setting up another legal showdown over the federal government's authority over immigration. Last week, we talked about campus-wide elections here in the 40 acres, and the results for that election were revealed earlier today in the William C. Powers Student Activity Center. Grayson Loudermilk and Fisher Carr won the president and vice president positions, respectively, for the Graduate Student Assembly. Mackenzie Henningsen won the editor-in-chief position for the Daily Texan, and students also voted yes on the referenda asking if the WCP Activity Center, that's room 1.102, which previously housed the Multicultural Engagement Center, should be the space for the new center developed in consultation by a student committee appointed for the Division for Campus and Community Engagement. Grace Kelly and Al Grinnell won the position for the Student Government's Executive Alliance. Reporters Meta Sarin, Kevin Myers, and Ariba Barmal spoke with them after they found out they had won the election on what they plan to do next. Take a look.
Hug our parents, hug our moms, celebrate with them. They got their perfect, cute matching outfits right now.
But also thank everybody, because we couldn't do this without everyone who voted for us. So honestly, just like tell everyone, the whole student body, how much we appreciate them for voting for us.
Yeah, I think thanking everyone is definitely the first step. We're very fortunate to have such a large and really helpful team that really, I think, made this dream come true. So reaching out to all of them personally and really just like thanking all of them. So.
Yeah.
All of the elected positions on the Dean of Students website. Now let's take a look at some of the primary election updates. After a visit at the border of Eagle Pass, former President Donald Trump was joined by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, according to the Austin American-Statesman. During the visit, Abbott expressed his endorsement for President Trump, but in an interview, Trump said Abbott is, quote, absolutely under consideration to be his running mate as vice president. However, on Friday, Abbott weighed in saying he would rather be governor of Texas. President Trump also said in the same interview that U.S. Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, who was recently his opponent in the Republican primary for president, is also on that short list. In other election news, Washington, D.C., Nikki Haley, she's a candidate in Washington, D.C. for the primary, and she won there last night. She took 63% of that GOP primary vote. President Trump took 33%. That gave Nikki Haley 19 delegates from D.C., and Washington, D.C. was one of President Trump's weakest contests during his first run back in 2016. Finally, the Supreme Court ruled today that Trump should appear on the ballot in Colorado. The court unanimously decided that former President Trump could not be unilaterally removed from the ballot, but a 5-4 majority decided that no state could dump a federal candidate off any ballot. Trump called the ruling a, quote, win for the country. And turning now to our main topic for tonight, tomorrow's primary election here in Texas. When we come back, we'll sit down with representatives from Texas Votes, the University Democrats, and the UT chapter of the Young Conservatives of Texas to talk about why students should get to the ballot box. We'll also hear from Joshua Blank from the Texas Politics Project. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Tower Talks. We are here with our panel of representatives from various student political and elections organizations. On the far right down here, we have Jackson Paul. Jackson is the co-chair of the UT Austin chapter of Young Conservatives of Texas. Jackson is also a co-founder of the Texas Horn. That's an independent student newspaper at UT. He's also vice president of the UT chapter of the Thomistic Institute, a member of the Jefferson Scholars Program, an undergraduate fellow at the Austin Institute, and a fellow of the Civitas Society of Fellows. Long resume there. We love to see it. Next, we have Scott Poole, the president of Texas Votes. As president, Scott oversees voter registration and education efforts on campus. And finally, here we have Matthew McCoy. Matthew is president of the University Democrats and has previously served in various other positions at UDEMS. Matthew also worked as a student organizer for Zo Quadri and Beto for Texas. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate it on the eve of Super Tuesday. Thanks for staying up late with us.
I'll be yours.
Diving into our first question for you all now, while you all have very different roles all across campus and here in Austin, you're all focused on getting students out to vote, out to the ballot box tomorrow. As we know, students are extremely busy, but Gen Z's power is quite big as we keep going from election cycle to election cycle, and it's biggest this cycle that it's ever been. So, what's your message, Scott? I'm going to start with you about why students should head to the polls tomorrow and make their voices heard.
Yeah, so my message to students would be that there are elections up and down the ballot that will affect your day-to-day life, and your voice matters in that. As long as you're registered to vote in Texas, registered to vote in Travis County, you can vote anywhere at our on-campus polling locations, either at the LBJS school or at the Fallon Academic Center. Polls are open from 7 to 7, and those are really important elections. It's really important that your voice specifically is heard. Regardless of your policy positions, regardless of your preferences in candidates, there will be elections that will impact how you live, and for that reason, you should go out there and vote tomorrow.
Awesome, and I would send it back to you, Matthew, with the same question there. Why should students, especially students that you're representing in UDEMS, get out there and vote tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think Scott said it really well. I think it's really important that this is truly how Gen Z shows that they can hold political capital, is by showing up to the polls and voting. If they can show that, wow, here at UT Austin, these students really show out to vote, that puts eyes on UT, that puts eyes on Texas, and that shows that Gen Z and students really do hold political power and political capital here in Austin. And I think we really saw that in the Zo Quadri election back in 22, with UT Austin really turning out and delivering that victory to Zo Quadri back in that race. So it's really important to organize, to get out there, to vote, and really show that if you can make a difference in your local state elections as well.
And we'll get more into voter registration and voter engagement efforts that all of y'all have been working on over the last several months in just a minute. But first, Jackson, sending it back over to you, what's your message to students that you have worked with about why they should hit the polls tomorrow?
Sure. So my message is one fundamentally of gratitude. We have the privilege of living in the greatest nation on earth right now, and we should show our gratitude for that by keeping it that way. So if you look around and you think, I've had a pretty good life, I've had, a country where I can say what I want, I can associate with who I want, I can worship who I want, I can do all these things in the way and live my life as I want, and I want to keep things that way, then the way you get out by doing that is by voting. And so whatever you like about America, whatever you're grateful for, well, the way you ensure that you continue to have it, so you continue to be grateful for it, is to vote, and is to vote for people who will, and ideas who will keep things that way. So that's what I'd say. When you vote, you're not just influencing the future of the country, you're making an expression of gratitude, and you should do that for whatever things you are grateful for in the United States.
Thank you. So we are all very on the same page that voting is important tomorrow in these elections. Let's talk about some of the efforts that y'all have made over the last several weeks and I'm sure months and in past election cycles to get students here on campus out to vote. Scott, I'll start with you. I know Texas Votes hosted a concert recently as part of an effort to get students to go to the ballot box. Tell us a little bit more about this and some other programs that y'all have initiated to get students out there.
Yeah, so Texas Votes, we have three main components of our civic engagement programming. The first is in-classroom presentations. So as the only nonpartisan and non-advocacy student organization at UT's campus, we're one of the only organizations that's allowed to go inside a professor's classrooms and register voters inside the classroom. Our second component is on-campus tabling, so you might see us throughout the year just tabling to register voters. And then the third part, which you mentioned, our concert, we host events. So that concert really was an effort to get students to go to the polls early. We know that students tend to encounter longer lines, voters in general encounter longer lines on election day. So we were really trying to get people to go out to vote. So we had a local band called the 4411. They came out. It was a lot of fun, really cool. Great band. Would highly recommend checking them out. It was a lot of fun. We gave out 2 tickets to the Fall Out Boy concert in Austin, just trying to get as many voters out to vote early. So yeah, that was a little brief rundown of what we've done.
Lots of incentives there. I'll come back to you, Matthew. Tell us a little bit about some of UDEM's efforts to get people both registered and get them out to the polls both early and then tomorrow for Election Day.
Yeah, so we were on a pretty tight timeline coming back this semester. It was pretty much 5 weeks of voter registration, usually at our table. We're pretty much out there most days of the week tabling, getting voter registrations. All of our members, we had a VDR training session, a volunteer deputy registrar, so all of our members can register people to vote as well. We host our weekly meetings as well with usually a lot of local electeds or local officials that help tell people, Anyway, after that, a lot of recent things. After the voter registration deadline, we were doing a lot of lit dropping, poll reading, door knocking. We've done all the political events that you can do. And so we're doing what we can to get people out there to vote. And yeah.
And I'll send the same question back over to you, Jackson.
Sure. So there are fundamentally 2 aspects of this that YCT has tried to deal with. On the one side, ensuring that everyone who's eligible to register is registered. And the way we've done that is at various meetings, we've had people there capable of registering voters. Whenever we'll have tabling events and such, and we'll try and bring people into our meetings, bring them in this. That's one of our selling points. It's like, hey, we'll make sure that whatever you need to do to vote, we'll get that all set up for you. But the second aspect is making sure that our members and that the UT community at large have access to information which let them do research so that they can determine how they would like to vote. And the way we go about this is in a couple of ways. First, YCT's statewide organization publishes ratings of the Texas legislator, of every member there, and kind of gives an analysis to their voters. And we, of course, provide this to our members and make sure that they can look so they can say, hey, if you're in this district, then here are the going to be people on your ballot. Here's, assuming that they're incumbents, here's kind of a breakdown of their voting record, some key bills that they've voted on. And by providing this information to our members and making it accessible, we're ensuring not just that they can make a vote, but they can make an informed vote. Because really, getting out the vote isn't just about maximizing the number of people who got registered. It's about making sure that every citizen of this country has the ability to make a vote and make a vote in what they consider to be their own interests.
And let's talk a little bit about what voting looks like specifically for college students here on campus. We have out-of-state students who, like myself, come here to Texas and switch their voter registration, which presents challenges within itself. What are some challenges that y'all notice and have heard from students, especially you, Scott, when you're registering students to vote? I'll start with you about what might be stopping them from getting to the polls, or just some workarounds and possible solutions to those as well.
Yeah. So in Texas, we don't have online voter registration, so you have to fill out a physical form. Most of us do it when we get our driver's license at the DMV, but if you don't have a driver's license at the DMV, you don't do it there, you'll have to fill out a physical form. So sometimes it can be tricky if someone doesn't write legibly. They're not gonna. There might be a little mix-up with how that registration form is processed. The people at the county do their very best to figure out what you wrote your name down as, but they don't always get it 100% right. So I'd say that just the nature of the online process, or the paper process, the lack of online voter registration is one thing that impacts our effectiveness. The second thing I would mention is obviously just a lack of information. So as a college student, you can vote either at home, assuming you're not from Austin, or here using your Austin address. So some people don't know about that. They also might not know that you have to register wherever you want to vote 1 month before the election. So that's a very important part of our work, is trying to make sure that we update people that they need to update their address, and they have to do it a month before Election Day. So lack of online voter registration, not knowing where you can vote, and also not knowing that there's a month that you have to register a month before. Those are the biggest 3 challenges that I've encountered doing this work.
And Jackson, I'll send it over to you before we get into some of the solutions and things for students to remember when they make a plan to vote tomorrow. But first to you, do you echo any of these concerns that students have faced? Have any students, especially within your organization, come to you with worries about making sure that they can get out and vote?
Sure. So, I mean, getting out to vote, like, definitely the sort of thing which, especially if you're not voting here in Austin, if you're voting, as I do, back in your home place, in your hometown. I, for instance, am from Houston, and I have kept my voter registration there. But it is definitely, like, the sort of thing which requires careful planning. But I do think that, like, if you put in like a modicum of effort, and if you do, you know, especially if you're involved in a political organization, because I think all 3 of us have ensured in various ways that any member of our organization who wants to vote knows what they need to do and the steps they need to go through. So I do think if you are willing to go to something like, to take the time to go through these steps, that you are able to vote fairly simply. So what I'd say to students is, it's like, fundamentally, voting is important, and we want it to be as easy as possible, but it's not as hard as, it can be. So just be prudent, plan, because the earlier you get it done, the easier it's going to be for you.
And one question I would just pose to you, and Matthew, feel free to add on to what we were talking about regards to voter registration, but primaries obviously typically bring out some of the most politically engaged students. How do you, within your work, reach students and show them, even if they're not the most politically engaged, because those are the people who are traditionally influenced and drawn to these primaries, how do you remind them that it's still important for them to get out and vote in this election as well?
Yeah, we try to make it as easy as possible for students to vote. Texas is not an easy state to vote in, and I think that's partially by design. You often hear that Texas is a non-voting state, and that's because it is so difficult to get registered, and there is no online registration, and you have to file to register to vote 30 days ahead. So we want to make sure that we always have a big push on voter registration deadline night. We're always out there until midnight. I know Texas Votes is out there as well. Just a giant voter registration push every cycle, and we just want to make sure that students have the information that they need to vote, and then that they actually follow through on that, and then go out and vote, early vote. Don't wait till election day, because you often see you'll have to wait in lines. So we always heavily encourage early voting.
And Jackson, I want to send it back to you. I know a few comments there from Matthew about voting here in the state of Texas. Any response on your end?
Yeah, so I'd say, I mean, definitely there are states that have made it more logistically simple than the vote in Texas, but it's a matter of perspective, where I would echo what's said, that if you vote before Election Day, it's a lot easier to vote then, because you'll be waiting a lot fewer lines, generally speaking, than on Election Day. And that goes back to what I was saying about, like, if you put in, like, a modicum of planning, and if you are, I know as college students we love to leave things to the last minute, but I'd say is, don't leave voting to the last minute, and it'll probably be, you'll have a higher chance of being able to vote with a less logistical strain on yourself.
I just want to also throw in there that a lot of people don't know that a lot of these primary elections are doing, no matter like how much information we try to put out there. And single time without fail, even during election day, we have students like, oh, I'm registered back home. Oh, I haven't registered here in Austin yet. Or, ooh, I've moved apartments since then. And then they're like, can I still register? And I think it's by design that Texas does not make it easy for you to vote or to change your address. And then it also puts in that 30-day restriction 30 days ahead of election day. So I think Texas really does try to limit, especially students who are moving around frequently and just people that are younger. It does make it intentionally hard for them to vote. And we try to navigate those issues, but that's just the nature of Texas election laws as they stand.
And Scott, I want to take it back to you when we talk about all of these different logistical challenges that students might have. Tomorrow's Super Tuesday. Tomorrow the polls are open at 7 a.m. What is your message to students as they work to make that last-minute plan if they haven't voted early, especially if they're voting here in Austin on campus?
Yeah, so 2 important things to remember. The first is that you need to have a valid form of voter ID. You got 7 options in the state of Texas. The 2 most common are going to be a Texas driver's license or a U.S. passport. The second thing is that you're not allowed to bring your phone into the voting booth. So make sure that you write down any of your selections beforehand. Just take a look at vote411.org, which is a nonpartisan voter guide from the League of Women Voters. You can see candidates' positions on both sides of the aisle, or in this case, both sides within the aisle, given that it's a party primary. But just make sure that you can also go to the county website, put in your address, and you'll get a sample ballot, and you can print one of those out and fill it out. So just make sure that you have one of the valid forms of ID and that you know who you're going to go vote for beforehand.
And let's talk a little bit about early voting turnout so far. Turnout here in Texas is currently at around 10% overall. We're a little lower here in Travis County, running at around 8.5%. But in Central Texas, compared to the rest of all of the counties here, Travis County is having less turnout in other districts. I'm curious to know if y'all, how y'all have felt about the energy of early voting so far here on campus with our 2 polling locations at UT Austin. And an interesting thing that I'll point out there too is that 2/3 of turnout so far has been in the Republican primary so far here in Texas. Any questions? I'll start with any one of y'all. I'll send it to Jackson first.
Sure. So on the point about the turnout, I think that when we talk about turnout, it's merely like a surface level symptom of a larger issue, which is the issue of do people feel politically engaged? Do they feel like they have a stake in the process? Because people for whom the answer is yes, then they, in many cases, don't even need to be like pushed into voting. They'll just like say, oh, I care about the process, so I'm going to look up what I need to do to vote and do that. So I think that when we talk about, oh, we've got a 10% turnout rate or whatever, well, you have to ask yourselves, why do the other 90% not want to vote? Why do they not feel engaged in the political process? And I think if you address those root issues, if you make them feel like, hey, I've got a real stake in my community, I feel like I'm engaged in the process and understand what's happening and who I'm voting for and why, then the problem will in many cases organically solve itself. So obviously we do want to focus on the issue of voter turnout directly. We also, I think, can be a lot more effective if we address some of the underlying issues and work to build people as broader community engaged, or broader citizens more broadly engaged with the community, of which voting is merely one aspect.
And I'll send it back to you, Matthew. You mentioned, Jackson, some ways that why do those 90% feel politically apathetic and not interested in the political process. At least in early voting, we should caution people can still head out to the polls tomorrow. But I ask you, especially, what do you hear from your members? What are some hesitations, especially in a primary, as to why they might not want to head out there and vote?
Yeah, and I just want to say that it would be a lot easier to get these numbers higher if we had same-day registration or if the deadline wasn't 30 days before. But it's really hard to drive turnout when it's really the presidential candidates that really drive a lot of the turnout in these primary elections. And when you have on both sides presidential primaries that are non-competitive or that pretty much the candidates have been locked in for quite a while now, that neither side really has a presidential candidate to really draw people to the polls. And then as for the reason why the Republican Party is having really high turnout across Texas right now is often in Texas you often hear that the Republican Party is the party of the election of consequence. The Republican primary is the election of consequence in Texas, and that is because that the Republican primary really dictates a lot of the state legislature. Of course, Republicans have held a majority in the state legislature for quite a while in Texas now, since the 90s. So, well, before I was born, certainly. So that's why I think a lot of the Republican primaries have been a lot higher. They're seeing a really nasty state local primaries happening, especially in rural parts of Texas right now. And as for Democrats, it is super, super important on all levels to be voting on your state and local issues as well. But just without a presidential candidate on the top of the ticket, it's really hard to see people driving out to the polls without a candidate uniting people behind.
And certainly a lot to dive in there, whether we mention the presidential or also into some local Texas races. When we come back, we'll continue with our panel here talking about all things student voter turnout, and we'll also touch more on this voter apathy that we mentioned, and of course continuing to talk about why students should vote. And later, before we head out of the show, we'll hear from Joshua Blank from the Texas Politics Project. Stay tuned. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, we are joined by representatives from student political organizations right here on campus. From right to left, we have Jackson Paul, Scott Poole, and Matthew McCoy. Thank you all for sticking with us, and thank you for continuing to watch. We'll dive into the candidates in the issues in just a moment, but let's talk at the presidential level a little bit where we left off. The race is shaping up to be an expected rematch, as we mentioned, but here on the local level, tell us a little bit, Jackson, I'll start with you, about some of the candidates and specific issues that you're watching and races that will be important to you as election results pour in tomorrow night.
Sure. So on the presidential side, within the Republican primary, which of course is where our primary focus is going to be, it is expected that President Trump is going to, win the majority of not just Texas electoral delegates, but of the electoral delegates available on Super Tuesday. But it'll be interesting to see exactly how what his lead is and whether Governor Haley where she moves on that, because it's probably going to dictate a lot of kind of our strategy as we look towards the election in November, how exactly the primary moves from here. Then, of course, on the state level, we have YCT has actually released its endorsements in the primaries on its website, so you can check it out. For the state level, we have endorsed, of course, Senator Ted Cruz as well as Representative Chip Roy, who are two of our big endorsements. We've endorsed a couple of people in the state Senate and a whole bunch in the state House. So primarily, what we're going to be looking at is how do our endorsements do, because depending on how that goes, YCT strategy as we move into the general election and what districts we kind of encourage our members to learn more about, what districts we kind of like direct people who want to get more engaged to get engaged in, is going to depend on how endorsements do. So those are going to be kind of where YCT approaches its area of interest tomorrow night.
And we'll dive into some of those endorsements in just a minute, but first, sending the same question over to you, Matthew. Tell us a little bit about what things you'll be watching as results come in tomorrow night.
Yeah, so we're very involved in the state and local level here around Travis County. As an organization, we don't endorse in federal or the president and vice president positions. So we're primarily focused on the state and local issues. The big ones right now that we're watching is Lloyd Doggett, our congressman, has a primary challenger. He should be fine. He should be safe. But other than that, there's quite a few district races that are very important. We have Maggie Ellis for the 3rd Court of Appeals. We have Shereen Thomas running for the 353rd District Court as well. And then the big one that we're hearing a lot about in Travis County is Jose Garza running for re-election as our Travis County District Attorney, who right now has a primary challenger in the Democratic primary, who was recruited on the last day before the filing deadline, and is also primarily funded by campaign backers that donate in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to Greg Abbott and Trump as well. And so he's running in the Democratic primary. You might be getting a lot of those TV or YouTube or Hulu ads for that election right now. That's one that we're going to be watching pretty closely come election day.
Yeah, and Scott, I'll send this to you. When you are registering voters on campus, especially obviously before that filing deadline, when you talk with them, obviously I know y'all are nonpartisan, but do you ever hear from them about specific issues or things that may have happened to them personally, or just things that are happening currently in the news that are driving them to come to you and say, I want to register to vote?
Yeah, I think most people focus on big, even year elections, so obviously the midterms and the presidential election. I'll just say, as someone who doesn't have a dog in this fight, the thing that I'll be watching for is the Republican State House primaries. There's a couple issues in the legislature, mostly having to do with public school funding and also with Ken Paxton's impeachment, the Attorney General. So there's going to be a little bit of a battle over some incumbents, both on property tax funding and property tax relief, public school funding, and then also over the Attorney General's impeachment. So I think those will really shape the legislative session that we'll see next year, and so I think that's going to be some of the most interesting races to watch tomorrow night.
And I'll go back to you, Jackson, because Scott, you mentioned the lots of interesting things happening in the Texas State House. Lots of Republican primaries that we mentioned before we headed to break getting very interesting as Republicans are running against each other within these primaries, some backed by President Trump and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who were against the impeachment of current Attorney General here in Texas, Ken Paxton, back last year. One of those notable races includes Dade Phelan, the current Speaker of the House. We were talking earlier about how former Governor Rick Perry is out campaigning with him and obviously at odds with his former boss, former President Trump. What do you make of races like that one and others happening here in Texas on the Republican side?
Sure. So fundamentally, like, primaries are time for Republican voters and for conservative voters to make clear to the party and to the movement where we want to go, where should our focus for the next 2 years and the next 4 years be. And so when we see these in many cases, very spirited primaries, in many cases we see this as a sign of, hey, the base is engaged, and we want to use this as an opportunity to see what sorts of issues do we care about. Now, to talk about the issues you specifically mentioned, first on the Ken Paxton impeachment, there were many people who were, good conservatives with very strong records on both sides of that fight. So it is in many ways unfortunate that a lot of attention in the primaries is focused there, whereas we might have preferred it to focus on more substantive issues like the other issue brought up, which is school choice. But, it's politics, and sometimes there are going to be personalities and politicians who are pushing against each other, and it's great that we can get that sorted out in the primaries so that, moving into the general election, there's kind of a more united vision within the Republican Party specifically of what it wants. Now, on the school choice issue, one of the biggest issues in the 88th legislative session was school choice and attempts to expand access across Texas to alternative educational mechanisms, such as, for example, educational savings accounts. And where people came down to this within the legislature is, I think, one of the big issues which a lot of voters are looking towards on both sides of the issue. So it's going to be really interesting tomorrow to see whether voters are supporting going even further on providing school choice and providing these sorts of access to the students, or whether voters are less enthusiastic in that direction than we might hope. So those, I guess is kind of where it comes down on those two issues and how we are analyzing the primaries in regards to them.
You mentioned spirited primaries. I think we got a spirited panel here. Matthew, I see you shaking your head there on school choice. Do you want to jump in there? And then also I'd love to dive into some of the races that y'all are watching as well on the Democratic side.
Yes, so Democrats are very united against these school vouchers. You can hear school choice or education savings accounts. These are essentially handouts to private schools that do not follow the same regulations or the same requirements that public education does. We have not seen teacher pay raises in several years, and I know teachers, especially after the pandemic, are struggling with that. There's been multiple attempts to increase funding for them. Usually there have been tide vouchers, and they have not passed. We've seen multiple special sessions now that Abbott has tried to force vouchers down the throat of Texans, and he has been failed to get them passed in these multiple legislative sessions, and that's primarily because of around a group of 20 Republicans that are mostly in rural parts of Texas where there are no private schools in the area, and these would be handouts to this would take away from a lot of these public schools, where in a lot of these communities, the public school is the backbone of their community, and they haven't seen pay raises or increases in funding in quite a few years. So this is really the issue that has been dividing a lot of the Republican primaries, and then we really have Greg Abbott, who has been really pushing these school vouchers, and he is the one that is leading the charge in primarying a lot of these attacks against these Republicans. And a lot of these Republicans that are facing these primary challenges, a lot of them have decided that they don't want to run for re-election, and because they don't want to face the primary challenges that Abbott is throwing against them.
Jackson, I know you want to respond there, and then we're going to come back to you, Matthew.
Yes, thank you. So what I'd say on the issue of shunting money to private schools, that kind of misses the point. The point is our educational savings accounts, our school vouchers, going to result in a better education for Texan children. And I think that the evidence is very clear that yes, it will. That letting parents decide which school better fits their child, which educational method, whether it be one school or another school, or a private school, or even homeschooling, empowering parents to make decisions like that for their children is going to result in better outcomes for Texans. And maybe it will result in more money going to private schools, or maybe the public schools will use this as a challenge to say, hey, we're facing a bit more of a free market competition now, so let's kind of up our game and boost test scores and boost educational outcomes. And if so, I really hope that happens. But either way, the point of an education policy is to produce an educated populace. And if these educational savings accounts and school vouchers achieve that, then it doesn't really matter where the money's going. What matters is that we are achieving our policy goals here.
And sending it back to you, let's talk a little bit, Matthew, about, I know y'all have made endorsements as well. We have a very active Democratic primary on the Texas Senate side to run against Senator Cruz in November. Very competitive race in 2018 with Beto the last time. Do you see that race possibly being as competitive this time?
So there's actually quite a few candidates in the race. There's two main ones right now. We have our endorsed candidate, Roland Gutierrez. He's running as the more progressive lane. He's the state senator from Uvalde, so of course they had the horrific tragedy a couple years at Robb Elementary School. And those poor parents and poor families were done so terribly by the state legislature. And it's tragic what has happened there and how they were treated in the state legislature. He's running a more progressive approach, and that's partially why we have endorsed him. He is better, in our opinion, on immigration. He's better on gun control, and he's better. He's also called for a ceasefire in Israel-Palestine as well. Colin Allred as well. Both of these are great candidates. I just want to point that out there. They're both great to run against Ted Cruz in November. Colin Allred is definitely taking more of a moderate approach. He's a congressman from Dallas. He's a former NFL football player, played football at Baylor as well, and turned a civil rights lawyer after he retired from the NFL. It's important to note that he's also raised a substantial amount more money than Gutierrez at this time. But right now, it's hard to make any predictions at this point. But where we're seeing a lot of the Democratic primary early turnout is in the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, which is more of a Roland Gutierrez stronghold. And with quite a few candidates in the race, and there's over 6 candidates in the race, it's pretty likely that this race is going to go to a runoff, and that's because if no candidate receives over 50% of the primary vote, it will go to a runoff, and that'll be in late May.
Just quickly for me, within your organization, what would you say are some of the issues that are driving voters to the polls, especially here in the primary tomorrow? So
driving people to the polls right now is certainly abortion, especially here in Texas. We have Kate Cox out of Dallas, has been a national figure, tragically. It's a tragic story. But abortion is going to be a massive, massive issue in the November election. We have Greg Abbott really pulling up all the stops on the media campaign down in Eagle Pass on his 2.5-mile stretch on the border for all the media coverage that Fox News has been blaring on repeat for weeks on end. And then Israel-Palestine, of course, you saw that we had the first bit of aid today. Air dropped in. Kamala Harris just called for a ceasefire. Long overdue. It needs to stop. But that's been two issues that have been driving people to the polls, and then also some that have kept people away, that make them less enthusiastic, especially Democrats, less enthusiastic for Biden at this time.
And Jackson, quickly for me on the Republican side, I know we mentioned school choice being an important issue, and certainly some Republican primary politics when it comes down to the Ken Paxton impeachment, but on the issues, what are some things that you find students in your organization are heading to the polls for tomorrow?
Sure. So on the statewide issue, it's definitely school choice. But in addition to that, some national issues which are driving interest in the primaries are the economy and immigration. On the economy, of course, we've seen record-breaking inflation over the past 4 years, thanks, as many economists will say, to the unprecedented spending of the Biden administration. And inflation, unlike many other political issues, really does affect students. Like, they can see things getting more expensive that they're paying for, and especially for students on a tight budget, they're really seeing the impacts of the fiscal policies of this administration. So that's one thing that's getting them out there to vote, the economy, inflation. The other issue is immigration. We have really, over the past year, seen I think a very big tide shift in the discourse around immigration, as we've seen that the situation on the southern border is just untenable. Like, whether or not you support a relatively large amounts of legal immigration or more moderate amounts of legal immigration, like having a situation where you can have millions of people crossing the border, it creates a massive security situation where you can say, we want to take all of these people, many people will say, we want to take all these people in as asylum seekers, and even if you accept that, then the actual way that they're coming in, where they're overwhelming these cities, is creating a lot of problems, I think, for a lot of Americans. And so they're getting out to vote, and they're saying, we definitely want to vote border security. We definitely want to elect politicians who are going to care about our border. So I'd say that the three big issues in this election for Texans are school choice, the economy, and border security.
And just to close out here with you, Scott, in 15 seconds for someone who might not have seen this entire hour tonight with all of y'all talking all things Texas primaries, in 15 seconds, what do you say to them to get them out to vote tomorrow?
Your vote matters. Your policy preferences matter. All polling sites are open from 7 to 7 tomorrow. All you need is one form of valid ID. And please get out there, remind your friends, remind your family, and let's make this this election one with high voter turnout.
Yes, certainly, especially here on the student side. Well, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate you all being here tonight. When we come back, we have an interview and a sit-down with Joshua Blank. He is the research director of the Texas Politics Project. Looking forward to y'all seeing that. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Tower Talks. Last week, Tower Talks associate producer Rayan Sheikh sat down with Texas Politics Project research director Joshua Blank. They talked about why local races are important and more. Let's take a look.
And, as far as the actual elections within the primaries go, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of specific offices that are up for election, but everyone's attention tends to be on the presidential race or, maybe even Ted Cruz and his election. But since there's so many other elections, one, why is there not as much attention on these smaller, maybe even like Texas legislature elections? And two, should there be? Are those important?
Well, they're absolutely important. I mean, I think, first and foremost, part of the reason that the big races get the most attention is because they get the most resources, right? And they spend the most resources. And so they have the ability to get their names out, to get their messages out. And that gets harder and harder as you go down the ballot. I mean, essentially, if you want to say if you want to guess how much money a candidate is raised, you can sort of look at what level of office they are. And as you go down the list, you're going to see less and less money. And money is really necessary to communicate, especially in a state as large as Texas. But even at the local level, it's still really hard to necessarily get your message out in a city as big as Austin or Dallas or Houston, right? At the same time, these races are incredibly important. I mean, ultimately, for example, if you live here in Austin, the Democratic primary is where the contest is going to take place. In November, most Democrats are going to win in this Austin area. It doesn't really matter who they are. So if you want to have an influence, especially over local politics and policy, it is really the primary, and especially here in Austin, the Democratic primary, where you get to actually weigh in and make a choice.
Right. Kind of shifting gears into another policy issue that is kind of on Americans' mind that you also wrote about in your blog, which is about foreign policy and the changing American opinion about how they want the country to stay out, take aid away from Ukraine, Israel, all these sources. And recently there was a pretty substantial uncommitted vote in the Michigan primaries, Democratic primaries. As far as I know, there isn't an uncommitted option on the Texas Democratic ballots, but seeing how these patterns have shifted, one, is Americans' opinions of foreign policy also going to affect the primaries and the main election? And two, will it influence Biden's, maybe not him winning, but how much he wins?
Sure. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the primaries. I mean, to the extent that it's having an impact on the Democratic primary at the moment, you are seeing it as you raise, and maybe some sort of protest votes against the president, in particular with having to do with his handling of the Israel-Gaza situation. But looking ahead to the general election, it could have an impact in the sense that one of Biden's strengths when he ran in 2020 was his foreign policy credentials and the fact that he had a very long career with a lot of experience in history, especially in the U.S. Senate, having to dealing with foreign policy issues. To the extent that Americans, but actually in particular Democrats, are having second thoughts about his handling of some of these conflicts, that could lead to some softening of his support that may be consequential, not in some sort of dramatic way, but because the elections are just so close. Right? We just have such close presidential elections at this point. One of the questions I think that we're looking at as we go to 2024 is, in some ways, how much support does Biden lose among Democrats? Not that they're going to go vote for Donald Trump, just that they're just not going to show up. And likewise, how much support does Donald Trump lose among Republicans? Again, not that they're going to go vote for Joe Biden, but that they're just not going to show up. So in some ways, in elections that have become increasingly about mobilizing one's own party, there are features of both candidates that make them a little bit less attractive to their own partisans. And for Joe Biden, one of those features might be foreign policy.
Right. Then kind of touching on the Texas primaries again, you guys also talked about how Abbott and Paxton and their campaign endorsements, even though they aren't running this year. So can you tell me a little bit about how those effects have been coming through on polling and how they might come through with the primaries?
Sure. A big, really the main story in a lot of ways for, I think, people who follow Texas politics closely has been efforts by both Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton to weigh into Republican primaries for the Texas House against incumbent Republican House members. For Greg Abbott, the main reason he's doing this, or the issue that has led him to do this, it has to do with Republican House members' votes against his desire to establish a school voucher program in Texas. And there's a cadre of about 21 Republicans who joined with all of the Democrats to vote against basically allowing a voucher program in Texas. And Greg Abbott is now, in many cases, actively campaigning against those members. For Ken Paxton, his impeachment is the main reason for his involvement in House primaries, and he's essentially endorsed against every House Republican who voted to impeach him, which is almost all of them,
right.
and has voted to, and basically has given his endorsement to those who voted not to impeach him. Having said all that, our most recent poll, we asked about the importance to potential primary voters of basically ideology, specific issue alignment with candidates, and endorsements. And endorsements was the third most important among those three. And then we also asked, well, whose endorsement do you care about if you care about endorsements in these House primaries? And Donald Trump was at the top. About 24% of potential Republican primary voters mentioned the former president. About 7% mentioned Greg Abbott. And I think fewer than 2% mentioned the Attorney General, which is not terribly surprising. Right. And so that is kind of the big question here. Now, I should say that these endorsements may or may not matter, but what does matter is the fact that the governor is pouring massive amounts of money into these races to try to unseat these incumbents. And in these small districts with these low turnout elections, the real question is that huge inflow of money enough to change the preference of the district? Right. In a lot of cases against the Republican incumbents who have received his endorsement in the past, right. and often in many cases have run unchallenged prior to this election cycle.
Tomorrow, March 5th, is the last day to vote in the Texas primaries. If you are on campus, you can vote, as we've said throughout the night, at the Flan Academic Center or at LBJ. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., so be sure to go out and cast your ballot. Be sure to follow us on social media at TSTV Tower Talks on X, formerly Twitter, and at Tower Talks TSTV on Instagram. From all of us here in the studio, I'm Logan Dubel. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight. Make sure to go vote tomorrow. We'll see you back here next week.